You stole my culture, hermano. You took what belonged to my people and turned it into your Hollywood bullshit." The words cut through the backstage area of Madison Square Garden like a knife, stopping conversations and turning heads. Eddie Guerrero stood face to face with Hulk Hogan, his usually cheerful demeanor replaced by something raw and dangerous. What happened in the next 3 days would haunt the wrestling world forever. November 10th, 2005. Thursday night, 11:47 p.m. The backstage area at Madison Square Garden was buzzing with the usual post-show energy. Wrestlers were unwinding, sharing stories and preparing for the long journey to the next city. But in a quiet corner near the catering area, a confrontation was brewing that would expose years of buried resentment and cultural tension. Eddie Guerrero had just finished one of the best matches of his career, a technical masterpiece that reminded everyone why he was considered one of the most gifted wrestlers of his generation. At 38 years old, Eddie was in the prime of his career, holding the respect of his peers and the adoration of fans who appreciated authentic talent over manufactured stardom. But tonight, something had pushed Eddie over the edge, something that had been building for months, festering like an infected wound that refused to heal. The catalyst was a conversation he had overheard earlier that evening. Hulk Hogan, speaking to a group of WWE executives, had been discussing his upcoming appearance at a Latino heritage event. "I've always connected with the Latino audience," Hogan had said with his trademark confidence. "They see me as one of their own. The Latino Heat gimmick I've been working on could really capitalize on that connection." Those words hit Eddie Guerrero like a physical blow. Latino Heat wasn't just a catchphrase or a marketing strategy. It was his identity, his heritage, his connection to a culture that had struggled for recognition in professional wrestling for decades. And here was Hulk Hogan, the ultimate American hero, casually discussing appropriating it for his own benefit. Eddie had built his entire career around being proud of his Mexican heritage in an industry that had traditionally portrayed Latino wrestlers as stereotypes and sideshows. He had fought to bring authenticity and respect to Latino representation in wrestling, turning Latino Heat into a celebration of culture rather than a caricature. Now Hulk Hogan wanted to take that and package it for mainstream consumption, stripping away its meaning and turning it into another marketing tool for America's wrestling hero. Eddie approached Hogan with the measured steps of a man trying to control his temper. His hands were steady, his voice was calm, but anyone who knew Eddie Guerrero could see the storm brewing behind his dark eyes. "Hulk," Eddie said quietly, "we need to talk." Hogan turned with his usual smile, the practiced expression of someone who had spent decades being approached by fellow wrestlers, fans, and business associates. "Hey, Eddie. Great match tonight, brother. You really tore the house down out there." "Cut the bullshit," Eddie said, his voice still low but carrying an edge that made nearby wrestlers take notice. "I heard what you said to the executives about Latino Heat, about connecting with Latino audiences, about making it your gimmick." Hogan's smile faltered slightly. He had been in the wrestling business long enough to recognize when a conversation was about to turn serious. "Eddie, I think there might be some misunderstanding here." "No misunderstanding," Eddie interrupted, stepping closer. "You want to take Latino Heat and make it yours. You want to put on a sombrero and wave a Mexican flag and pretend you understand what it means to be Latino in this business. But you don't understand anything, hermano. You don't understand the struggle, the discrimination, the years of watching our people portrayed as jokes while you got to be America's hero." The backstage area had gone quiet. Wrestlers who had been joking and relaxing moments before were now watching with the uncomfortable fascination of people witnessing a car accident. This wasn't typical wrestling business. This was personal, cultural, and potentially explosive. Hogan raised his hands in a gesture that was meant to be calming, but came across as condescending. "Eddie, brother, I respect your heritage. I've always respected Latino culture, If I said something that came across wrong, I apologize. That wasn't my intention. Your intention? Eddie's voice rose for the first time, carrying the pain of years of frustration. Your intention doesn't matter, Hulk. What matters is what you do, and what you do is take whatever you want from whoever you want and turn it into money. You did it with bodybuilding. You did it with movies. And now you want to do it with my culture. Eddie's fists clenched at his sides, not in preparation for a physical fight, but from the sheer effort of containing his emotions. Do you know what it was like growing up watching wrestling and never seeing anyone who looked like me portrayed with respect? Do you know what it was like having to prove myself twice as hard as everyone else because I was Mexican? Do you understand what Latino Heat means to kids who finally have someone to look up to who shares their heritage? Hogan was starting to realize this conversation was deeper than he had initially understood. This wasn't just about a gimmick or a marketing strategy. This was about identity, representation, and cultural respect in an industry that had often failed to provide any of those things to minority wrestlers. Eddie, I hear what you're saying, Hogan began, his voice more serious now. But I've always tried to be inclusive. I've always tried to connect with all of WWE's fans regardless of their background. Connect? Eddie laughed, but there was no humor in it. You want to connect by putting on our culture like a costume? By taking our identity and making it part of your act? That's not connection, Hulk. That's appropriation. That's taking something sacred to us and turning it into entertainment for people who don't understand what it means. The weight of Eddie's words hung in the air like smoke. Other wrestlers were beginning to understand they were witnessing something significant, a confrontation that went beyond typical backstage politics or creative disagreements. Eddie continued, his voice gaining strength as he articulated feelings he had carried for years. You've been the face of this company for decades. You've made millions of dollars being America's hero. You've never had to worry about being taken seriously because of your last name or your accent or the color of your skin. And now, when you're looking for something new to keep yourself relevant, you want to borrow our struggle and our pride like it's just another character you can play. Hulk Hogan stood silently for several seconds, perhaps for the first time truly understanding the depth of what Eddie was saying. The accusation of cultural appropriation was serious, but more than that, it revealed the pain of a man who had spent his career fighting for authentic representation in an industry built on characters and gimmicks. You stole my culture, hermano, Eddie said again, his voice now carrying the weight of every Latino wrestler who had been stereotyped, marginalized, or reduced to a caricature. You took what belonged to my people and turned it into your Hollywood bullshit. The silence that followed was profound. In a business where everything was scripted and controlled, this moment of raw authenticity caught everyone off guard. Eddie Guerrero had just accused Hulk Hogan, the most successful wrestler in history, of cultural theft, and he had done it with a passion and sincerity that made it impossible to dismiss. Hogan's response, when it finally came, surprised everyone who was listening. Instead of defending himself or dismissing Eddie's concerns, he did something that few people had ever seen him do in a professional setting. He admitted he was wrong. Eddie, Hogan said quietly, you're right. I didn't think about what Latino Heat means to you and your community. I saw it as just another angle, another way to connect with fans. But you're right. I was wrong to think I could just adopt something that represents your heritage and your struggle. The admission stunned the watching wrestlers. Hulk Hogan never admitted he was wrong about anything related to wrestling business. His entire career had been built on confidence and the belief that he knew what was best for the industry. Eddie studied Hogan's face, looking for signs of insincerity or manipulation, but what he saw was genuine recognition of the pain he had caused, and perhaps the first real understanding Hogan had ever shown for the challenges faced by minority wrestlers. I grew up in a wrestling family, Eddie said, his voice calmer now but still intense. My father, my uncles, they all wrestled. They all dealt with promoters who saw them as Mexican stereotypes instead of athletes. They wore masks, not just for tradition, but because it was easier than fighting the prejudice they faced when people saw their real faces. Eddie's words carried the weight of generations of Latino wrestlers who had struggled for respect and recognition. When I got to WWE, I made a promise to myself that I would represent my culture with pride and authenticity. Latino Heat isn't just my gimmick, Hulk, it's my responsibility. It's my way of showing Latino kids that we belong here, that we can be heroes too. The conversation had evolved from a confrontation into something deeper, an education about cultural responsibility and the power of representation in entertainment. Eddie was teaching Hogan, and by extension everyone listening, about the difference between appreciation and appropriation. I never thought about it that way, Hogan admitted. I guess I've been so used to adapting different personas and gimmicks that I forgot some things can't just be adopted. They have to be earned through experience and authentic connection. Eddie nodded slowly. That's exactly right. You can appreciate Latino culture, you can support Latino wrestlers, you can be an ally to our community, but you can't become us just because you think it would be good for your career. What happened next was unprecedented in backstage wrestling history. Hulk Hogan, the most successful wrestler of all time, asked Eddie Guerrero to teach him how to be a better ally to the Latino wrestling community. "Tell me how I can support what you're doing without appropriating it," Hogan said. "Tell me how I can use my position to help Latino wrestlers get the respect and opportunities they deserve." Eddie was quiet for a long moment, processing this unexpected turn in their conversation. He had prepared for anger, defensiveness, or dismissal. He hadn't prepared for genuine interest in learning and making amends. "You could start by using your influence to make sure Latino wrestlers get main event opportunities based on their talent, not their ethnicity," Eddie suggested. "You could speak out when you see Latino wrestlers being stereotyped or marginalized. You could help create storylines that show us as complex characters instead of one-dimensional caricatures." Hogan nodded thoughtfully. "I can do that. I should have been doing that all along." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Eddie explaining the history of Latino representation in wrestling and Hogan listening with what appeared to be genuine interest and respect. By the end, what had started as a confrontation had become a dialogue about cultural responsibility and allyship. They parted that night with a handshake and what seemed like mutual understanding. Eddie had successfully defended his cultural identity while educating one of wrestling's most influential figures. Hogan had learned something valuable about the impact of his actions and words on communities that looked to wrestling for representation. What neither man knew was that this would be one of the last meaningful conversations Eddie Guerrero would have about his cultural legacy. 3 days later, on November 13, 2005, Eddie Guerrero was found dead in his hotel room in Minneapolis. The official cause was heart failure, brought on by years of substance abuse and the physical toll of professional wrestling. He was 38 years old. The wrestling world was devastated. Eddie had been universally beloved by his peers, respected for his talent, and admired for his dedication to representing his culture with dignity and pride. His death sent shockwaves through WWE and the entire wrestling industry. But for Hulk Hogan, Eddie's death carried an additional weight of responsibility. Their conversation 3 days earlier had opened his eyes to the struggles faced by Latino wrestlers and the importance of authentic representation. Now, with Eddie gone, Hogan felt obligated to honor the commitment he had made. In the weeks following Eddie's death, Hogan quietly began using his influence exactly as Eddie had suggested. He recommended Latino wrestlers for better storylines, spoke out against stereotypical portrayals, and used his platform to advocate for diversity and inclusion in wrestling. At Eddie's memorial service, Hogan spoke about their final conversation and the impact it had on him. Eddie taught me that being a hero isn't just about entertaining people, Hogan said. It's about using your platform responsibly and lifting up others who might not have the same opportunities you've had. Years later, when wrestling historians looked back on Eddie Guerrero's legacy, they often pointed to that backstage conversation at Madison Square Garden as a defining moment. Eddie had used his voice to protect his cultural identity and educate someone who had the power to make real change in the industry. The tragic timing of Eddie's death, just 3 days after their conversation, added profound weight to his words. His final act of cultural advocacy became a lasting lesson about the importance of standing up for your heritage and holding others accountable for their actions. Hulk Hogan would carry the memory of that conversation for the rest of his career. Whenever he was tempted to appropriate elements from other cultures, he would remember Eddie's words, "You stole my culture, hermano," and he would choose a different path, one that honored Eddie's legacy and the principles he had died defending. The backstage area of Madison Square Garden had witnessed many historic moments, but few as personally meaningful as the night Eddie Guerrero stood up to Hulk Hogan and changed both men's understanding of cultural responsibility in professional wrestling. In his final week of life, Eddie had delivered one of his most important performances, not in the ring, but in a quiet corner where truth mattered more than entertainment. Eddie Guerrero's legacy extends far beyond championships and technical excellence. His courage to confront cultural appropriation, even when facing wrestling's most powerful figure, created ripple effects that transformed how the industry approaches diversity and representation. The phrase, "You stole my culture, hermano," became more than just words. It became a declaration that authenticity and respect cannot be compromised for entertainment value. In those final 3 days before his death, Eddie had achieved something that no victory in the ring could match. He had changed a man's heart, and through that change begun transforming an entire industry's consciousness about cultural responsibility and authentic representation. Today, when young Latino wrestlers face challenges or discrimination in the industry, they often remember Eddie Guerrero's final stand at Madison Square Garden. They remember that speaking truth to power, even at personal cost, can create change that lasts far beyond any individual career or championship reign. Eddie Guerrero's legacy in wrestling extends far beyond his technical skills or memorable matches. His final conversation with Hulk Hogan proved that the most important victories sometimes happen outside the ring, in quiet moments where principle matters more than politics, and where standing up for what's right creates ripple effects that can transform an entire industry.